Well, welcome everyone. I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Politics and Journalism. Delighted that you could join us, and I want to welcome our television audience as well. When we started this building and this program, some of you have heard me say the goal was to invite some of the best writers and thinkers to this center for programs. And tonight's program fulfills that goal as far as I'm concerned. To my left, and I mean that in every sense of the word, we have three of the best living writers in the South. And that's not hyperbole, that's true. And I was privileged to be able to work with both Ed and Lou on the Daily Mississippian when I was at Ole Miss, and Bill Rose is here, he had the same privilege. Curtis was a little ahead of us, ahead of me, so I didn't have that privilege then, but each one of them has done a terrific job in their later careers. And we may get a chance, and I hope we will get a chance, to talk about their later careers. But we're here really tonight to celebrate, I think, some of their earlier career work. And Curtis Wilkie, who is the inaugural fellow of the Overby Center, is going to lead this discussion because he was one of the co-conspirators in this early effort. And I'll jump in at an appropriate time, but I'm going to let Curtis introduce Ed and Lou in any way he wants to, and then begin the conversation. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, well, thank you, Charles. Just briefly, to my right, rarely on my right, is Ed Williams. Ed is originally from Missouri and came down to Ole Miss and wound up being editor of the Daily Mississippian, and after graduation joined me very briefly at the Clarksdale Press Register. Then he went into the Army, and then he emerged from the Army and went to work in Greenville for the Delta Democrat-Times, and where he was joined by a real Delta lad, a bit farther to the right, but again, we got it all backwards. Lou Powell. Lou is from Coahoma County. Virginia, you just said which town in Coahoma County?
Powell.
From Powell? You are from Powell.
More or less.
Okay.
That's what they say.
I spent my time in Coahoma County too, and I'd forgotten there was a Powell, but okay, Lou Powell from Powell. But Lou is also an Ole Miss grad, and he too wound up on the staff of the Delta Democrat-Times in Greenville, and I was in Clarksdale, so we were all there in the Delta in the 60s. And it's important for the sake of the conversation tonight, which is largely about the Mississippi Freelance, which is the great little monthly that Ed and Lou started and kind of terrorized the state for a year. That when this started, it's important that we remember that in Mississippi, we still had, for all practical purposes, segregated public schools. We had on campuses, on the university campuses, a speakers ban where certain speakers who were considered too liberal were not allowed to speak on campus. So much for First Amendment. Sovereignty Commission was still very much spying on the people in Mississippi, and Citizens Council still existed, and we were a one-party state then, but everybody was conservative Democrat instead of a conservative Republican. So this kind of set the scene for the late 60s when the Mississippi Freelance started. How did it get started? Whose idea was it? And was it modeled on anything? And did you have any hopes of surviving or making any money in Mississippi with such a publication?
Well, I'll speak to the part I know about. We were reporters in Mississippi, so the notion of making money obviously had never occurred to us. We hoped, we were used to living hand to mouth, and we did pretty much the same thing with Mississippi Freelance. One thing we knew was, while we were very interested in writing stuff, we were not at all interested in selling advertising. So as a matter of principle, we decided there would be no advertising in it, that we would we would make do with money that came from subscriptions. So we made do with very little. Mostly, I think what I wanted to do at least, was to have the freedom to write anything I wanted to about anything I wanted to. And when you're working for even a very good daily newspaper, a lot of what you do is determined by what's going on in the community. So, you might not think that going to the city council meeting that day is the high point of your life. You nevertheless go because you need to be there and report on it for folks. We wanted to be able to choose the kind of things we do. So, and we managed to do that. Lou and I have been close friends for a while and worked very well together. The other thing that appealed to us was this. People were saying an incredible number of absolutely stupid things in Mississippi at that time. I'm sure that's no longer true. And nobody was saying, boy, those are stupid things you're saying. So we sort of created a little forum where we could do that. And I think snippishness was one of our most valuable qualities.
Surely not.
I know that's hard to believe. Let me turn it over to Lou, who Lou was an accounting major, so he is at Ole Miss, so he's more orderly in his approach to this. Would you say?
Yes, I would, since I was the one doing the books, such as they were. We had 400 subscribers at $4 a head, which just about covered our expenses. The thing that comes to my mind when I think about this time was that this was, as Curtis said, there was much of the old ways of doing things, what Dr. Silver referred to as a closed society. But there were also things changing in 1969. And some of the things that we covered were kind of exemplary of that, like Charles Evers's inauguration, the moratorium in Washington, which was the only non-Mississippi story we ever had, as Curtis covered. There was a rock festival, political festival in Mount Beulah, which included Black Panther talk and psychedelic drugs, and all this stuff is happening at the same time that M.M. Roberts is saying these outrageous things from not even from the 50s and further back than that.
That's the chairman of the college board.
Yes, extremely racist, outrageously racist things. So you had a lot of friction between old and new going on in this year that we existed. This was also the year that Ole Miss opened its the first legal marijuana farm, which we were the first reporters to be there. And Allard Lowenstein spoke here. We wrote about that. So there was a lot of friction going on. This did not particularly show up in our circulation figures, but we knew early on that there was not going to be financial reward. It was just I guess you could call it an experiment, journalistic experiment that lasted a year, and that was about the right amount of time for it.
But you were on the cutting edge. This is a tattered one. This is the first edition, and here's an Ed Williams story on the front about the WLBT fight over the license there, and they lost the SEGs lost their license down in Jackson at Channel 3, and I dare say that you read far more about the case here than you would have in the Clarion Ledger back then.
Almost certainly. But the other thing is because we were writing monthly, we were writing more magazine kinds of stories that took a kind of overview and provided more context than the newspaper stories did. One of there was no rat too small for us to kick, and we had in here a collection of short items that we called Possum, reports from our far-flung correspondents. The possum was kind of hanging, listening to all this stuff. Let me just read you a couple to give you a sense of the flavor of some of what we did. An interesting month at Ole Miss, this one says. Or, meanwhile, back in the 19th century, a black student was refused a shoe shine, then a haircut in the university barber shop. After the Black Student Union threatened threatened an administrator with a lawsuit, a spokesman for the university said the shop would now be open to all students, though he refused to admit that that hadn't been the policy all along. Okay, this is the summer editor of the Mississippian. Assumes she spoke for the student body about the recent departure of law school dean Josh Morris, who was essentially, I am told, forced out because he was too liberal. Others may want to disagree with that, but we're the ones with the mics. Here's what she said. She agrees with me. Morris probably was run off because of his liberal tendencies. But so what? This is Mississippi, and the way of life here is conservative. The university was simply active to preserve this way of life, the way Mississippians prefer. Well, we thought things like that should be pointed out and held up, frankly, to ridicule whenever the situation arose. Here's another one, and then I won't read anymore. The most incredible news story of this yet young year must be the lead story in, surprise, surprise, the Jackson Clarion Ledger of March 9th. The foot-long story, headlined First Baptist Preacher Hits Racetracks, reported the regular Sunday morning sermon of Reverend Larry Rohrman at Jackson's First Baptist Church. This is when the Heddermans owned the paper. First Baptist is the place where God goes when he wants to be near the Heddermans, who own the Clarion Ledger. Not unexpectedly, the pastor railed against a bill pending in the state house, which would have legalized parimutuel betting at proposed quarter horse racing tracks in a few counties. Legal gambling would be, and I quote, be an open invitation to mobsters, dope peddlers, prostitutes, etc., the pastor said. That he took that position isn't surprising. That the largest newspaper in the state considered it the day's most important story is. The old newspaper dictum that dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog is, usually prevails even in the bizarre news pages of the Clarion Ledger. Now, a one-question quiz. Would you say the Heddermans, who own the newspaper, favor or oppose legalized betting at horse races? People reading that stuff would say, this is crazy, but nobody was saying it out front. So we decided we'd be the ones to say the emperor has no clothes, and we took every opportunity we could find to do.
Do you think you got under the skin of the Heddermans, and did you hear anything back when you take shots at them like that?
No. I think we were like a fly. What's Plato's line, buzzing at the ass of the state. We were small potatoes. The Heddermans considered us no threat to anything. Although I admit, during this time, roughly, there were the riots at Jackson State, in which a couple of people were killed, and the Heddermans press didn't even send a reporter to campus. They relied on the Associated Press report of it. So we had an organization of journalists, I don't remember what it was called, but that had a meeting in Jackson, and I proposed a motion saying that we censure, C-E-N-S-U-R-E, not censor, that we criticize the Hedderman Press for not covering that big national story in its own backyard. My fellow journalists found that to be a radical proposal and hushed me up. But, it was there's in W.J. Cash, The Mind of the South, he does a long discussion about the reluctance of people to criticize power. And it started, he said, with the laws forbidding criticism of slavery back before the Civil War. And then it expanded, Cash said, so that people were afraid to criticize anything that seemed to challenge what he referred to as the Southern way of life. And Mississippi, at the time we were doing this, was, I think, one of the clearest demonstrations of how true Cash's observation was. I mean, people were literally almost mentally handicapped by their unwillingness to criticize things that were obviously wrong. And it had, at this point, to do with preserving the Southern way of life, which meant racial segregation. And anything that threatened the Southern way of life was deemed to be almost traitorous. So we were gleeful traitors. I mean, we criticized it all the time and had a good time with it. But we were so small that we were speaking mostly, I think, to an audience of people who agreed with us. And it made them and us feel good to have it said. But I can't say that we had any great impact on the powers that were.
But you did run stories that the press in Mississippi wouldn't run. Here's a Lou Powell story, Academic Arrogance at Southern. The president of what we call back then Mississippi Southern plagiarized his doctoral thesis, and nobody would touch it. Yeah. Lou Powell did it. There it is. You read it first and only in Mississippi Freelance.
That was and still is an amazing story. And the reason that he got away with it is that the newspaper in Hattiesburg was owned by the Hattermans. So it was they had complete lockdown on any kind of negative criticism, any kind of negative comments at all.
About a closed society, is that a good?
Yes, that would be it. Yeah.
What's some of your other oldies but goodies, Lou, from the era?
I really loved the revolt at Mount Beulah, which was the festival that I talked about earlier. There was a guy, and I would love to know who he was, who was wandering around that day. There was a confrontation between highway patrolmen and some of the hippies. There was a guy wandering around with on his head a cube made out of mirrors. So he was just investigating as the policemen were interrogating the people, and it was dizzying to figure out what was going on there. It was such a strange experience. Amazingly, nobody got arrested that day. The highway patrolman left, but it was the Kudzu, which was an underground paper. This is not an underground paper. This is a conventional newspaper. Kudzu underground paper in Jackson was sponsoring it, I think. That was very interesting. And Charles Everett's inauguration in Fayette was interesting.
Back when Charles was good.
Yeah, this was a long time ago.
Lou, how do you draw the distinction between an underground newspaper and what you were doing?
Well, we didn't. We had real type. We didn't just have typewriter script. But we followed basically the same rules that we followed when we worked at the Delta Democrat Times. A little cheekier, a little more opinionated, but and we weren't interested in fomenting rebellion per se. If rebellion were to happen, that would have been fine. But we basically wanted to lay the facts out there.
It's basically kind of a smart-ass, flippant tone, but you never went out on a limb with your credibility. You didn't lose any credibility with anything you ever wrote.
I think that's true. We were doing journalism, and it was, as Lou say, journalism with a snap, kind of cheeky, but we want to get our facts straight and have our conclusions make sense. Whether you agreed with them or not, you could see how we were reaching the point that we were reaching, and you could see the values we were basing it on. So we weren't trying to persuade people for the sake of persuading people. We were trying to say, here are the facts. I grew up reading a couple of papers, one being the Memphis Press Scimitar, the afternoon paper, and on its masthead was the phrase, "Give light, and the people will find their own way." And we were trying to give light, and sometimes the people didn't find the way I wanted them to find, but that's up to them. We were trying to, it's a cliche, but report the otherwise unreported, and put it in some kind of context that made it let you see what was going on and why. I was downgrading the notion that we had power, but let me read you one brief thing that shows how much power we did have. The president of Mississippi State University, we referred to him in an otherwise favorable piece as looking, quote, rather like an undertaker with his conservative blue suit and tie. Well, then he makes a speech to a civic club in Jackson, cites the Mississippi Freelance article, and modeled his new maroon blazer as evidence that he had abandoned his sartorial stodginess. And I think that may have been the biggest change we made in Mississippi.
In fairness, at that time in my life, I thought everybody looked like an undertaker.
And many people did. Here's another thing on the same page. Let me read you this because it's the kind of thing that we just delighted in. Virginia Graham, a daytime TV talk show hostess who combines the most irritating characteristics of Ann Landers and Jacqueline Suzanne, spoke at Ole Miss recently at an ODK mortarboard program. Here's what she said. America has one hope, she said, and that lies in the Southern woman with the beauty, charm, and intelligence, but who also knows how to make a man feel like a man. We noted that we could remember not too many years ago when ODK had to scrape up such relatively unenlightening speakers as Margaret Mead, who didn't even have a TV show. One of my favorite stories, I was in Jackson covering the legislature for the Delta Democrat Times and papers in Tupelo, Gulfport, and Vicksburg. And there came a time when some students were suing over the state monkey law, the law forbidding the teaching of evolution in schools. So Nay Gore, a representative from Marks, Mississippi, decided he'd try to repeal that law. And it set off the, how did I describe it? The greatest volume of chest-thumping theological bombast and unadulterated fundamentalist buffoonery heard in the legislative halls since the monkey bill was first enacted in 1926. Let me read you just a couple of quotes. I love this stuff. W.T. McCullough, chairman of the Board of Deacons at his Baptist church, said this. He asked legislators to consider the cause of the Darwin theory. He was an atheist. He wanted to give a reason why we were here. I think if you depend on evolution, you have to rule out any consideration that man has a soul. I don't think man came up from a lower species. The thing I'm worried about is when a child goes to college and runs into an egghead professor who thinks he knows everything. He hears these eggheads talk about evolution and he believes it. And then as the debate got louder, James Harvey Turner, a farmer from Carthage and a legislator, gave his personal testimony. My parents didn't swing by their tails, he said. A few of them swung by their necks. I can't be a party to any bill that would make a monkey out of the Creator. And at this time, they're debating in the House chamber, and people are just going wild. Hey, you tell them, Buck, all that kind of stuff. Somebody is blowing a duck call into the microphone on his desk, and it's just getting wild. And here's Buck Meek, who was one of the great speakers, a lawyer from Eupora. He says, these college students are bringing this lawsuit, to do away with Christian laws. It seems like today, if you were born before World War II, this is in 1970, you just ain't with it. these are Christian statutes on our books, and they're trying to take a little bit more of them out of the state. Christianity is still in power in Mississippi. And he went on in that tone. It was like a revival meeting, and half the General Assembly didn't take it seriously at all. They were just egging each other on like frat boys on Saturday night, and it was wild. But just being able to record that, being part of that, being able to write it down so people could see it, was kind of thrilling to me. I mean, we really enjoyed being. No newspaper in the state published more than a 12-inch story about this. We devoted a whole page to it because it was just an insight into the thinking and conflict and furor that could be created on the floor of the legislature. And it was a joy to watch, I must say.
We got to tell your Sovereignty Commission story.
We'll let you do that. I think you were more involved in that than I was.
Luther Munford, who is now a Jackson lawyer, was a student at Princeton one summer and was interning at the Delta Democrat-Times, and also offered to do a story for us on the Sovereignty Commission. It was an excellent story. He did a really good job on it, and he had a lot to work with. But a couple of months later, I get a call from E. Webb Burke, who was the head of the Sovereignty Commission, who wanted to come by and talk. And what he wanted to talk about was an envelope that Luther had fished out of the trash can at the Sovereignty Commission with the Sovereignty Commission return address on it, which I had used to send a copy of Mississippi Freelance to Patricia Darien, who was in London at the time. She was one of our subscribers and supporters. So I thought this will really be funny to send this to her, and she'll see the Sovereignty Commission return address on there, and she'll really freak. Well, it never got to her because I failed to put enough postage on it. And it came back, not to send her, but to E. Webb Burke at the Sovereignty Commission, who wanted to know what the hell was going on with it. So he and his assistant, Mac Mohead, arrived at our house and had what I'm sure for them was almost as unsatisfactory a conversation as it was for us. But they ended up saying, well, don't do that again. And we said, okay, we won't do that again. But that was really, if anybody ever says what's an unintended consequence, that's an example.
Well, to demonstrate how incompetent the Sovereignty Commission was, Pat later sent me a copy of their report of their interview with you guys, and they had everything wrong.
Yeah, they mixed up Lou and me. They couldn't remember who was who.
The crack investigators.
Yeah, I mean, and this was the chairman.
They said I was a smart ass. Can you believe that?
It seemed right to me. But at one point they mentioned that we might be guilty of misappropriation of government property. I mean, what happened was Luther had snatched this thing out of the wastebasket. They were throwing it away. So we got on the phone and called our lawyer. We had a pro bono lawyer, J. Wesley Watkins. And Wes said, they said, what? And I told him, he said, put him on the phone. So he and Webb Burke talked a minute, and I could hear kind of the volume of Wes's voice, but I couldn't tell what he was saying. And after that, Mr. Burke said, well, we're going to let you off this time, but don't do it again.
Were you guys ever intimidated at all by anyone who disapproved of the Mississippi Freelance?
I wasn't, were you?
Can't recall.
I think we weren't well known enough to get in any trouble. I was intimidated, or people threatened me a couple of times over things I did for the Delta Democrat-Times, but it was anonymous phone call kinds of things, and they didn't pan out. The most afraid I was ever when I was working for the Delta Democrat-Times was a little juke joint named Tilly's on the highway between Greenville and Leland, and Mr. Tilley would sit there. He was kind of Buddha-like, sit there on a stool, and he had a fly swatter in his hand, and every once in a while he would swat a fly that was getting on the cheese or something. I don't know, but we went over there one night with Harding Carter, who was well known but not particularly well liked in many places in the Delta. And we were just going to have a quiet beer. And Harding starts interviewing people about what they think about the Delta Democrat Times. And I thought Harding was going to get a shot. I mean, first of all, people weren't thinking about it, but if he encouraged them to, they weren't going to like him very much. So we got out of there alive, and I felt good about that. But, you know, these were days when the Klan was fairly active. And if you were writing about racial stuff, you know, it was not unusual to get some kind of threatening phone call, but nothing ever came of any of them.
We were fortunate to live and work in Greenville, which was an island in a lot of ways in the Delta and in the state as a whole. There was considerable support and fewer risks of Klan activity, for example.
Kind of what Oxford's become today.
In some ways, Greenville was a river town, and I think that made a difference because it had active commerce with the outside world. The Percys were there and had a moderating influence. Jake Stein, whose son founded Steinmart, was there. Jews were involved in the founding of the Charlotte Country Club. I mean, it was just a much more, although the city...
Greenville Country Club.
Pardon me, Greenville's Country Club. I'm an old guy. It was just a more cosmopolitan place than most cities of 45,000 in Mississippi because of that contact with the outside world. Shelby Foote grew up there. It's a strong literary tradition and a fairly progressive political tradition. So we were sort of in a haven. In a way, and we had an editor and publisher who believed in writing about stuff that was going on.
And who published the Mississippi Freelance at cost.
Yeah, at cost, yeah. Harding always said that there was hardly anything in here that with a little editing couldn't have been in the Delta Democrat Times. That may be true.
Did he ever complain and say you held out something good that should have gone in the DDT that you put in the MF instead?
No, I don't think
he wouldn't have admitted it. Yeah. But the economic problem with the Democrat Times was that once you got out from Greenville to Hollandale and Glen Allen and all those places, there wasn't anybody to buy the newspaper, so there was nobody to support stories far outside Greenville, although we did have a Jackson bureau for a time.
Yeah.
I don't want to take you off of Mississippi Freelance, but you both had such distinguished careers in Charlotte. Ed, I liked what you said, journalism with snap.
Yeah.
And both of you took journalism with snap to Charlotte. Tell us what moved you both to go to Charlotte, and then how you use that journalism with snap in Charlotte, both of you.
Well, what moved me to go there was I was about to be 30 years old, and I looked around Mississippi to see what opportunities were, and it seemed to me that most of the journalists in Mississippi who were able to make a living belonged to families that owned newspapers, and since I didn't, I couldn't see where my career led. Some universities have mid-career fellowships for journalists who kind of want to back off and do some reading and thinking and studying. And I applied for one at Harvard and won a fellowship to spend a year at Harvard, year of independent study. And
that was a Neiman?
Neiman Fellowship, yeah. And while I was there, one of the people who recommended me was Reese Cleghorn, who was a famous Southern journalist from Atlanta. And he had moved to Charlotte to become editorial page editor. So at the end of my Neiman year, I worked briefly for the Ford Foundation on the study of prisons, and then it was okay, but I missed the rush you get from engaging in daily journalism. So I wrote Reese a note and said, "How do you get into editorial writing?" And he said, essentially, come to Charlotte. And so I did, and stayed there 35 years. The Observer, I think, was the finest paper in the South. I wanted to work for a Southern newspaper. It's where I'm a Southern guy, and if there's anything I understand in the world, it's those things which are understandable about the South. And the Observer had a great reputation for doing quality work. We won 2 Pulitzer Prizes that I participated in while we were there. But then I became editorial page editor after a little while, and I started the day with 2 blank pages, and we could do anything we wanted to on them. So a lot of the kinds of stuff you see in Mississippi Freelance showed up later in the Charlotte Observer, because we'd learned something about the freedom to be a journalist who went where the story and where the journalist's instincts said to go. At Mississippi Freelance, we could do it because we were in charge. Charlotte Observer, we could do it because that's what they did. And it was a heady time to be there. I left in 2008, which was just before the great crash, and the whole world of journalism now has changed, of course.
And Lou, how did you get there?
I came a couple of years after Ed for similar reasons. I started as a feature writer. I was there a feature writer for 17 years, and another 17 years working for Ed on the editorial page, editing letters to the editor and writing columns. I think it's probably true for both of us that for us, the Observer was like the New York Times is for some people. That was I never wanted for quality experience at the Observer. The newsroom was wonderful. And to go back for a minute, the reason that I have an accounting degree that I never used is, one, I wasn't any good at it, and two, I fell in love with newsrooms when I started writing a column my last year at Ole Miss. And I knew that's where I wanted to be. It felt so good being with people of maybe not a light mind, but people who had a level of tolerance and intelligence and humor. It was just the right place for me.
And had lively minds. That's the thing. Let me tell you a story about Lou Powell's beginnings as a columnist. This may be true even. When I was editor of the Mississippian, someone slipped under my door a collection of observations that were truly scandalous, unsourced, and outrageous. And I wiped my fingerprints off the thing and threw it in the wastebasket. I think that was Lou's first column.
It was, as a matter of fact. I went by today to see the scene of the crime, which was still there, but it had been swallowed up by this palatial Trent Lott building, which had been attached to your dormitory
room.
room.
There too, LaBouve.
Yeah.
Room there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really resent that Trent took over our old dorm.
Well, I'm sure he's a good host. But that was it. And the Mississippian was just a great opportunity for young journalists, because the students really ran the newspaper. We had enormously talented people. Charles Overby worked on the Mississippi. I think you were sports editor when I was editor, maybe, yeah. And Gene Fair, who's now a distinguished judge, was on my staff. Julie Smith, who is a mystery novelist living in New Orleans, was on the staff when I was editor. A lot of talent, a lot of energy, and it was just a great place to be. And that's been true for me throughout my journalism career. In Clarksdale, where Curtis and I worked together, Greenville, and Charlotte were all places where you had the opportunity to do good work, and we enjoyed it a lot.
I want to let the audience ask some questions as well. Yes.
Lou, remind us about the Mississippi Southern story, the tales of that.
W.D. McCain, who was the president of Mississippi Southern, was a historian. He was editor of the Mississippi Journal of History, or whatever that name was, and he was head of the archives at one point. And he wrote a piece that had, I believe, 65 paragraphs in it, and 60 of them were taken virtually verbatim from a woman's thesis. And the other 5 were taken from somebody else's thesis. I mean, it was as flagrant a case of plagiarism as you would ever encounter. And some of the faculty at Southern were unhappy about it and had complained about it and were just ignored. So I wrote about it, and they continued to be ignored. He was. I'm glad you asked me that, because I've been wanting to go in and put that in his Wikipedia page. He has gotten away with it all this time, dead or alive. But it needs to be noted.
How did you find out about it?
A faculty member must have called me. I don't remember the circumstances, but it led me, after I did that story, led me to do another story about how McCain ran the whole campus in a military fashion.
He was a general, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he when they decided that they would make ROTC there voluntary rather than mandatory for male students, 2 years of it, he apologized to the student body. He said, "Some of you are going to be killed because of this decision, and your blood will be on my hands." He'd apparently forgotten that the Army, for instance, has basic training and advanced individual training. They don't just send you from the campus to the front. But he was something. I mean, he was the kind of guy you pray for if you're a journalist. It was really fun. I mentioned earlier that one of the Lou also did this. Lou did 2 interviews with William Waller and Bill Waller and William Winter after the governor's race of 1967. Lou's introduction to it says, "As always, the Mississippi governor's race of 1967 was dominated by hardcore segregationist demagoguery. As always, the prize went to the candidate who vowed to slay the federal dragon and protect the Mississippi way of life." But then he says that in that race were 2 unusual candidates, William Winter and Bill Waller. Waller finished something like 5th, but everyone agreed that if everybody's second choice could have won, it would have been William Waller, no matter whether you were for the segregationist, most segregationist, or the least. Waller made a great impression. So Lou asked them some questions. I want to read this because it's still talks about politics today. Lou says to William Winter, "In the campaign, you proposed common sense leadership that represents the spirit and thinking of 90% of Mississippi people. In light of the outcome," Winter lost by a fairly large margin. "In light of the outcome, do you think that 90% may have been a little bit high?" And Winter says, "If you could catch the people of Mississippi when they are not emotionally diverted, probably 90% would make the rational decision. The problem is political campaigns are carried on in the white-hot center, and the ability of people to discern is often disoriented." And Lou says, "Won't campaigns always be held in this white-hot center?" And Winter says, "Yes, surely, but the key to a more rational electorate is, I think, raising the educational level. But I have no delusions about the continued role of emotion in politics. To be successful, a candidate has to find the nerve ends to make people react. I have to believe, though, that we're gradually moving away from the effectiveness of this technique in Mississippi as the state's educational level rises." So then Lou asks Bill Waller a similar kind of question. How do you go about raising the quality of political debate from the segregation forever rhetoric that we've always had in past campaigns? And Waller says, "I don't know. I don't think there will be a change in the foreseeable future." This is 1969, I guess. "I don't think there'll be a change in the foreseeable future. There's a bedrock of folkways and mores that hasn't been touched yet. But I think change will come eventually from the vast group of young people who are demanding a more intelligent approach from the people they vote for. But it's always been the hardcore voters who have elected the governor, and there's still a majority of them around. The vote goes to the man who best represents custom and the past. They're scared to death of change. They feel comfortable only when they have an 1890 or a 1920 politician in the governor's mansion.
And would you say that that's really remarkable, both those? Say that's still true today?
Can you say Donald Trump?
That interview with Waller, I just realized that may have been the first time a candidate for governor of Mississippi ever used the expression folkways and mores.
Yeah, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
And he was elected 2 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah, there've been some glimmers, and then winter, of course, later. If you want to know what difference a newspaper makes in a state, look at the transition from the Clarion Ledger under the Hedderman's ownership to the Clarion Ledger under Charles Overby, when the newspaper changed from being an albatross around the neck of those who were working for progress to being an ally of the progressive movement in the state, particularly on matters of public education.
Well, yeah, thank you for saying that. That's a good segue, and I'm going to get you, Ralph, for me to ask you about whether you think the Charlotte Observer had an impact on a more moderate political environment in North Carolina.
I think the press in North Carolina certainly did. The Charlotte Observer, the Raleigh News and Observer, the Fayetteville Observer, you can name 3 or 4 more newspapers, all of which were very progressive on social issues of social justice, particularly race, and have continued to be as we've gone forward. I mean, it helps in a state if you have the most prominent news sources encouraging progress. And I think the Charlotte Observer certainly did, and the Raleigh News and Observer did, and they continue to do it. And they did it, I mean, my part of it was the opinion part. I was the opinion editor. But they also did it by their willingness to take on hard topics in the repertorial part of the newspaper. I mean, there probably were sacred cows for the Observer and the News and Observer. I mean, they were capitalistic enterprises that weren't going to be against capitalism, but I mean, so's America. You know, it's within the system we have. I think the Observer and News and Observer particularly work very hard to point out the flaws and the corruption that existed in both government and the private sphere. And by exposing those things, gave people the opportunity to say, this is not how we want things to operate. The Observer's first Pulitzer came on a series of stories about brown lung. I mean, the textile industry was huge in our area, if I may quote a Donald word, and powerful. And the Observer saw that people were dying because of unsafe working conditions in the mills, cotton textile mills, and did a long and deep series of stories about them, and crusaded for change, and showed how state governments had been co-opted by the power of the textile barons, so that the state didn't even inspect their mills. So you know, that makes all the difference in the world if you have people who are willing to, as I say, give light and let the people find their own way. And I think the press in North Carolina in general approached its responsibility in that regard in ways that I consider admirable. So yeah, I think it made a big difference.
I don't think, for example, that we would have felt the same urge to publish a North Carolina Freelance in 1969, because the quality of journalism statewide in North Carolina has always been pretty good.
Yeah.
Small papers, medium-sized papers. There were not these huge black holes that existed in Mississippi at that time.
Ralph.
Go ahead.
I just wondered, you were very articulate in your assessment of the government press in this comments about the antithesis of those, Bill Minor,
Yeah,
who
yeah.
took the time to put the unit moved to Mississippi, and I think gave another view of the truth than the Hedemans were revealing to us.
Yeah, I worked very closely with Bill Miner when I was in Jackson, and he was heroic. I mean, he'd been here forever. He had sources you could not believe, people who would call him up and tell him stuff. I couldn't believe it. I was in the same line of work he was. And he'd come into the Capitol press room just kind of bouncing, because he had something. And the problem was it was in the Times-Picayune, which hardly anyone in Mississippi read. And the Commercial Appeal had some pretty good people here for a time as well, but nobody compared to Minor. I was almost out of journalism. I come to Jackson with the agreement from these 4 small dailies that they would pay me something like $5 for each story I sent them. This was, I mean, we were talking earlier, young people in particular have no understanding of how isolated everybody was. I was doing these stories for the 4 newspapers, and the way I would get the stories to them was I would type them up and put them on the bus to send them to Vicksburg and Greenville. But I couldn't make enough money. I worked for a time in the S&H Green Stamp Redemption Center to supplement my income. And then Bill said, well, I've been needing an assistant. Bill was a stringer for the New York Times and Newsweek and, London Times. Everybody who wanted somebody in Mississippi knew they could call on Bill to cover stories for them. So he had a very lucrative, as it turned out, sideline of writing for all these out-of-state and in some cases out of the nation newspapers. And he said, why don't you just help me with this? And he paid me $50 a week, which doubled my income and kept me in journalism. I was otherwise not going to be able to make it. But he was, just a man of incredible courage. We have a story in there. He'd written something about John Bell Williams when Williams was governor, about his refusal to meet with the press and his frequent junkets that seemed to have very little to do with state business, and it made John Bell mad, so he banned Bill from his news conferences. He wouldn't let Bill come into the news conferences. And that went on for a while, and then the governor called him and said, well, come in and talk to me, thinking Bill was burned and would apologize. And Bill said, I'm not going to apologize to him. He said, the press conferences are almost a waste of time anyway. I get all the news I could handle. But he was just a remarkable journalist and man. And I think I've benefited as much from working with him as any other relationship I'd had in journalism.
Curtis and I were talking earlier this week in anticipation of your visit about how North Carolina politics and Mississippi politics are different, but mainly in the sense that North Carolina politics are not predictable. And North Carolina has sent very conservative senators to Washington, but have elected moderate governors. This presidential campaign, probably the only hope that Trump has of winning is to carry North Carolina along with Florida. So help us understand why North Carolina would be unpredictable, whereas Mississippi is pretty predictable in what it's going to do.
Yeah, well, I think I had a friend from Alabama who came up when I was editorial page editor at the Charlotte Observer and wanted to have dinner with some people. And he had with him a young politician who was very progressive. And he wanted him to talk with some people about how North Carolina became different. And what I told him was I thought it was the University of North Carolina system, that it was an incredibly progressive system with freedom of inquiry on social issues and issues of justice. And it kind of set a standard. And it sent its graduates out to be newspaper editors and reporters and lawyers and doctors and business people and all that. And they had that educational background that valued freedom of inquiry and progress on issues regarding social class and justice. And I think the university system is the reason North Carolina has been more progressive than most of the other southern states on most things. But it's always been a battleground. At one point, Jesse Helms was a U.S. senator, and Terry Sanford was a U.S. senator. Helms was a very conservative Republican. Sanford, probably as liberal as you can get and be a U.S. senator from the South. And those two forces fought it out. At present, the conservative side is on top in the state legislature because the Republicans put a lot of money into electing legislators to office and then took over the legislative apportionment machinery. So they created so many safe districts that I think there may be 8 out of more than 150 legislative seats that are competitive. The others are going to be won by one of the parties or the other every time till there's reapportionment. So we're fighting it out again, and you see it in the battles over HB2. The Charlotte Ordinance created protections based on gender and sexual preference and all that, and the legislature, dominated by the conservative Republicans, came in with a state law that eradicated Charlotte's efforts to do that and forbade any cities in the state to create protections for lesbian, gay, transgender.
And you're losing conventions.
And they so, I mean, it was such a blatant thing. There was no state, there were no state protections for anybody. And so in doing away with the Charlotte City Ordinance, they created a state ordinance that forbids discrimination based on race and a couple of other things that are already protected by federal law. But they very, very blatantly and willfully left out any protections for gay people. So if you're gay and your employer wants to fire, and people want to discriminate against you in, say, housing, if you want to buy a house and the owner finds out you're gay, they don't have to sell to you. I mean, there's all that whole range of things that we assume don't happen to gay people all the time. And Charlotte wanted to say, we're not going to have that here. And the legislature said, yes, we are. So it was that swift and sure action to strip away the protections Charlotte had provided for lesbians and gays that caused the reaction. And yeah, we've lost all kinds of sporting events. We've lost business relocations, conventions. I mean, Charlotte is really bearing the brunt, and the rural legislators, rural legislative leaders who are conservative Republicans don't care.
Lou, do you and Ed have a prediction on how North Carolina will go in the presidential election?
No.
Well, I can tell you what the most recent polls show. They show Hillary Clinton with a lead that's essentially within the margin of error. There's a U.S. Senate seat up this year. Richard Burr, who is by no means a right-winger. I mean, he's kind of business-oriented Republican who's about to lose his seat if the polls are correct, to Deborah Ross, a challenger who had been head of the state ACLU.
If he loses, the Senate will go Democrat.
Well, it may. I mean, there are, I think, four or five seats.
But that would be a bellwether of the rest of the country.
His is the closest among the ones that the Democrats would have to win, I think, to gain control of the Senate. There's a chance that Democrats may win enough seats in the state legislature to make at least to take away the veto-proof majority that exists in the legislature now. At present, it doesn't make any difference what the governor does. Governor McCrory, a Republican, has vetoed a couple of things. In both cases, the Republicans have large enough majorities in the state House and Senate that they could overturn his veto easily just by voting together. So it's a time when the conservatives are on top in state politics, but you know it may not last for long. We'll see. I asked Deborah Ross, who's running for the U.S. Senate, what it would take for her to win, And she said, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and Barack and Michelle Obama have to come to North Carolina and campaign a lot, because the difference is going to be whether you can turn out your voters. And they've been coming to North Carolina and campaigning a lot, so we'll see.
As we get ready to close, I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to focus on the special, really extraordinary partnership the two of you have had that started here at Ole Miss. And now you come back. I think it's been a while since y'all were here. Any closing words about both that partnership and how and whether the Ole Miss is a special place?
Well, it has been it's been very fortunate for me to have had the friendship with Ed that we've had over the years. He was a model for me in journalism, and Curtis was too. I was thinking earlier that one of the first real stories that I covered at Ole Miss was Bobby Kennedy's speech, which Curtis was covering for the Press Register at the time. And since then, Ed and I have just, we've been on the same track about a lot of things. It's, I'm not sure either one of us is all that easy to get along with, so we don't want to risk going elsewhere.
Well, my oldest and best friend, and here's how it started. I was going around to dorms campaigning for editor of the Daily Mississippian. And I went to Lou's dorm, I knocked on doors, I gave people my little spiel, and Lou followed me out and said, you know, that was really good. If you could just talk to enough people, I think you could win this thing. Lou refused to predict political outcome earlier. I lost that election by the largest margin in the history of campus politics, but later did get elected. But Lou told me later that after giving me that great encouragement, he went out and voted for my opponent.
I thought you had a chance to make history.
Well, I did. But I think it's true with everyone that I mean, Ole Miss has shaped my life, really. Jim Silver, I was a history major. Jim Silver, the professor, was one of the strongest influences in my life in his devotion to freedom of thought and his showing how a person who had an honest and moral dissent could stand up and speak out. And that's, on my best days, that's what I can do. He did it almost every day. And I think that was a powerful example. And then here are two of my best friends, Curtis. I mean, Curtis had been in Clarksdale about a year when I got there, and Curtis showed me what a joy it could be to be a journalist. I mean, the Clarksdale Press Register was reviewing operas in Memphis because Curtis liked operas, so he could go to Memphis, come back and write a review.
Free, too.
Free, that's it, yeah. But you know, poor Joe Ellis, who was the editor and publisher of the Clarksdale Press Register, was racked by anxiety because of people like Curtis and to a lesser degree me, just going out and writing about what they saw at a time when, you know, that could be very unpopular. And I think, like Lou, Curtis has been one of my strongest influences in understanding that if you're bright and energetic, you can get away with a lot of stuff in journalism. You can do things you want to do and enjoy it and maybe even make a difference.
You know, but I neglected during the introductions, these guys have their wives here. We have Ed's wife, Marilyn, and Lou's wife, Danny, and they're here with them, so we're so glad to have you all here, too.
We are indeed.
I want to give Curtis the last word on this program and some future programs, but first, let's thank Ed and Lou for coming and being here with us.